Good evening and welcome to the Fairfield City School District's Board of Education meeting for February 16th, 2023. Mrs. Lane, please call the roll.
Mr. Begley?
Here.
Ms. Birding?
Present.
Mr. Clark?
Present.
Ms. Gundrum? Mrs. Shorter?
Please join me. Stand for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance
to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
First up, presentations. Mr. Smith?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Begley. Members of the board, we do have one presentation scheduled this evening, FCSD fiscal status and future planning. This will be the first part of a two-part presentation. Second part of this presentation will be given during our next board meeting on Thursday, March 2nd. This evening you will be hearing from several district leaders as we make our way through the presentation. I will begin by talking about the purpose of the presentation. There are several purposes this evening. First, we want to educate our board and our community about our financial status today, as well as share a plan as to how the district intends to address that status by implementing some cost-cutting measures over the next several years. The second purpose is to allow for the board to have the opportunity to ask questions and provide feedback. Before we get into it, I want to talk a little bit about the background. So for months, anyone who has either attended our board meetings or has taken the time to watch online, Mrs. Lane gives those 5-year forecasts twice a year, I believe in May and November. Is that right? And we have been very transparent about what we knew eventually was going to come to fruition. So we've been talking about our team, how we could implement some cost-cutting measures that would minimize the impact on teaching and learning. Now, I use the term minimize because some cost-cutting measures will have an impact on teaching and learning. We've always taken pride in our fiscal responsibility. We recognize the importance of doing our best to provide an outstanding educational experience for all of our students. We often talk about balancing those two things, and I think that we've done that very well over time. We know there's so much more that we could do for our students, but the truth is that we just can't always afford it. As a district, we are consistently taking advantage of grants and looking for ways we can save money while providing the very best for our students. One of the best examples of the district being very strategic is in regard to the use of ESSER funds. We've talked about those ESSER funds at other board meetings during the last several years. We've used those funds to enhance our technology program, our one-to-one rollout. We've hired academic tutors to help close achievement gaps and provided summer school opportunities. Those are certainly just a few of the examples, but there are many more. I would just like to say I'm really proud of the fact of how we use those funds strategically to meet the needs of our students, to close some of those gaps, and I think the results speak for themselves. However, those ESSER funds are going to run out at the end of the next school year. We recognize the fact that we can't continue to provide all of those services that we've been providing with ESSER money because it simply is not sustainable. Those things, we weren't able to do those things prior to ESSER funds, and now that we're looking at those funds going away, we know that, again, that we can't sustain those services and supports, unfortunately. Also think it's important to point out that the cost-cutting measures alone will not be able to sustain us long-term. Even though they will save us millions, there will still be a need for additional revenue. I'm not going to get into the weeds this evening about the fact that how schools are funded in Ohio has been ruled unconstitutional. That happened decades ago, but nothing has really changed, as all of us are aware. We find ourselves in the same situation that many other school districts in Ohio have found themselves, needing additional revenue to continue to provide the services that we are providing today. We don't need additional revenue so that we can do more. This evening, we will talk about some cost-cutting measures that we intend to put in place so that we can potentially reduce the size of a levy. Long-term, we will need that additional revenue so that we can continue to provide the same educational experience that we are providing today. And I do want to say that, again, I think it's a very important point. This is not about needing more revenue so that we can do more. It's about more revenue so that we can continue to do what we are doing right now. We recognize the fact that there really never is a great time to ask for additional revenues, but we've reached the point where we can no longer put off having this discussion. And again, as I mentioned earlier, we have had some conversation over the last couple of years. I know that we had not a lengthy discussion in our November board meeting, but we had some additional conversation when we had our last 5-year forecast that we knew this was coming. In fact, this presentation this evening was put on the calendar for tonight probably back in July when we created the calendar for the presentations for the year because we knew that it had to happen. So at this time, I'd like to take just a moment to review some of the topics that we will be covering this evening. Mrs. Lane will be reviewing the 5-year forecast, which will help folks understand why there is a need for additional revenue. Mrs. Hauer will be talking about some potential staffing reductions through attrition and some potential changes to the structuring of our EL tutor program. Dr. Rice will be discussing some potential changes with the structure of our online learning program. Mrs. Lane will then talk about some reductions in building and department budgets. Mr. Perry will talk about potential changes to our capital improvement plan. And then lastly, Mrs. Lane will be providing us with some updates to our November forecast and will also provide us with a brief levy history lesson to cover the years 2011 to 2022. So I'd like to talk just a little bit about, again, desired outcomes for this presentation. It is our hope that our community will have a better understanding of our financial situation and how we plan to address that in the future. And then, as I mentioned earlier, we will have part 2 of this presentation at our next meeting, which will include options for the board to consider regarding the need for additional revenue. In addition to talking about the different options for increasing revenue, we will also talk about the timing and some deadlines that will come into play. Before I turn it over to Mrs. Lane, I would also like to point out that our district leadership team will continue to explore other cost-cutting measures. Just this week, not included in this presentation, we've identified some potential other opportunities, but we need to have some time to research those additional items. And as we do that, we will continue to update the board and our school community as we move forward. This time, I'll turn it over to Mrs. Lane for a 5-year forecast recap.
Thank you. As Mr. Smith mentioned, last November, I presented the 5-year forecast, and I'm not going to go into as much detail tonight, but just wanted to give you a summary and give the community a summary of some of the items that are included in that forecast. On the revenue side, we have 91% of our revenue coming from 2 different categories. Our largest piece of revenue comes from our property taxes, which is about 56% of our total revenue. In that November forecast, we are showing that we'll have some slight increases in collections over the life of the forecast. But again, slight increases, nothing significant from what we can tell, from what we're projecting. The second piece of revenue that we receive is about 35%, and that comes from their state funding. And that is under the Fair School Funding Plan, which is a phase-in plan over 6 years. So we are receiving some additional funding, but it's very, very slowly coming into our district over that period. All indications from Columbus at this point, when the governor has announced his plans, is that Fair School Funding Plan will continue, hopefully, over the next couple of years. So that's a good indication for us. Expenditure-wise, 77% of our expenditures come from salary and benefits. So we have included in that forecast minimal salary increases for the life of the forecast. New positions are tied usually or mostly to our special education needs or mandates, and also some additional preschool needs that we've had. As Mr. Smith mentioned, the American Rescue Plan and ESSER funds are ending. And so some of those, we have 2 positions that are paid for out of those funds will now have to be absorbed into the general fund because they are special education related positions, a psychologist and an intervention specialist. We also have some unfortunately, we received an increase for our health insurance premiums effective January 1st of this year of 17.9%. Hoping that that will trend down through the life of the forecast slightly. From all indications right now, it is looking fairly positive. One of the other pieces, Mr. Perry's going to address our capital improvements and some projects that we are shifting around as far as when we might handle those in the forecast. But the other piece that's in the forecast that's not on this slide is, everybody is probably experiencing right now, is inflation. And so we have built in, there is some percentages built into the forecast, hoping that those are close to what we might end up with by the end of the year. So we'll see about that. Next slide shows our general fund revenues, expenditures, and our declining cash balance. So the blue bars you see there are our revenue, the orange are our expenses, and as you can see, our expenses are trending upward where our revenue is staying fairly steady. The cash balance is that green line going down, and as you can tell from the graph, we are out of money, cash, June 30th of 2025, or close to that, which shows in this slide. So we have a $10 million balance, basically June 30th of 2025. By the end of July, that balance would be gone if we do nothing. So that is why tonight we are going to present some ideas to the board of some reductions. I will turn it over to Mrs. Howard.
Thank you. As we begin hiring for next school year, which we have already started doing, with both our professional and support positions, we are looking very closely for opportunities of staffing reductions through attrition. To help make these decisions before posting any vacated or open position in the district, we are looking very intently at student numbers. We're looking very closely at student need and building need to see if it is absolutely necessary for a position to be posted. One example of this would be our American Sign Language position at the high school. We have found through looking at student numbers and need, we do not need to hire a full-time ASL position for next year, so we are moving forward with it being a part-time position. That one change is an approximate savings of about $40,000. Other than that one example, at this point, I cannot put a dollar amount on additional savings that we could have through attrition, but like I said, we're continually looking at our numbers, continually looking at student needs, and as we learn of positions opening due to retirements or resignations, we are only moving forward with hiring what is absolutely necessary. There are a few positions that we're holding on at the elementary level to see what the numbers look like as we get closer to the start of next school year. So there may be an opportunity to save some money there, but only time will tell as we see what the student numbers look like as we prepare for next school year. At the end of the day, position cuts, they're never good. They do have an impact on our schools. But if we do need to make cuts, it is always better to reduce a position before there is a person attached to that position. So if we're able to do that, that's what we will do. That takes me to bullet number 2 that you see there, EL tutor program restructure. I'm sharing this information tonight on behalf of Mandy Ogg, who could not be with us because she is home ill tonight. So I'll do my best to answer any questions you may have in regards to this. But as you know from the presentation we had about our EL program not too long ago, our EL population has grown consistently over the last several years. As it has grown, we've continued to add EL tutors. At the start of the 2018-19 school year, the district employed 22 and a half EL tutors. That number now stands at 51. Considering the results of an EL audit and working with the curriculum team over the past couple of years, we've determined that this model is simply not sustainable that we're currently using for staffing. While we believe that EL tutor support will continue to play a very big role in our programming, we feel that we need to shift our focus. So one of the things that Mandy presented to the leadership team is restructuring of the EL tutoring program, and what that includes is a new tutor-to-student ratio. Our current ratio is 1 tutor to 50 students, 50 EL students for our elementary schools, and 1 tutor to 15 EL students for our secondary schools. What we're proposing is changing that ratio to 1 tutor to every 60 students for elementary and 1 tutor to every 25 students for secondary. As a result of this, our total tutor number district-wide would be reduced from 51 positions down to 37. We would work, it's important to note though that we would work to phase in this change over the next 2 years. And just a reminder, our EL tutor positions, they're not permanent positions. The people in those positions are on a year-to-year contract. Each year, we have a number of tutors who choose not to return. Usually, it's around 5 to 7 tutors who choose for one reason or another to not return to the position. So ideally, it's our hope that we would reduce the number of tutors through attrition over the next 2 years and not have to impact current employees. If we were to make that move, the potential savings to the district would be approximately $535,000. Are there any questions about the 2 items I've discussed?
No, not this time.
Just a quick clarification, the $535,000 would actually, it would be over 2 years. It wouldn't be 1 year, it would be over 2 years.
So we're going from 1 to 50 and 1 to 15 to 1 to 60 and 1 to 25.
Correct.
In over 2 years, that'll save $500,000.
Correct.
And of course, we care about the staff, but as you said, a lot of them come and go, and they know year to year. What is the plan? And maybe we don't have an answer to that yet for the children, the students. We continue to grow in that, and 1 to 60 seems very high. This 1 to 50, I think, is pretty high for some of these tutors as well. Maybe a Mrs. Aug question, but can you speak to that, or maybe that's something we can speak to?
The ratio for our EL teachers at this time, we're proposing that would remain the same. So we would still have our EL teachers in the building to be providing support. And in addition to that, one thing that we're really, and Mandy will be presenting more information on this at a later board meeting, but one of the things that we are looking to do is to provide more training for our general education teachers in the classroom on research-based instructional strategies that have been proven to be most effective with our EL students. So the more people that we have trained in these strategies, it's called a TESOL endorsement, the more support that we will be able to provide our students to hopefully help fill that void of having fewer tutors in the classrooms.
Okay. It seems like it puts a lot more on our standard teachers, which they already have a lot on their plate as it is. So, okay. More to come. Thank you.
Right. At this time, I'll pass it over to Dr. Rice.
Thank you. As you know, to graduate high school with a Fairfield City School District diploma, a student needs 20.5 credits, and we have that breakdown of the specific requirements in the program of study. We know that a number of our students in each grade, in each class, will need multiple opportunities in some of those classes. So my part of this presentation is dealing with online credit recovery. We saw as a result of COVID a large increase in students who were credit deficient, and we know that because they were at home, they were in a blended environment, some were unable or unwilling to log on. So we invested heavily in getting those kids caught up post-COVID. We feel now that our numbers of credit recovery are back to where they were pre-COVID, so we're glad for that. All that being said, we still have a large need for credit recovery, and it continues to be an ongoing strain to our finances that we no longer have the benefit of the COVID relief dollars to offset those costs. So current process for a student that is needing credit recovery, the guidance counselors would schedule a student into a class needing to be recovered. So this is a class that the student did not pass initially. A teacher on a supplemental contract is assigned to that student. That student is placed into a credit recovery lab, computer lab, and is allowed to use outside time to move quicker at a quicker pace to complete that course. The teacher is responsible for checking on progress and working with the student as needed. That teacher can receive up to 10 hours of mod pay time per student per course, so it quickly becomes pretty costly for the district. Upon completion of that class, the teacher turns in that grade to the registrar, and it is entered onto the student's transcript. This is an extremely costly design. We believe we can make programming changes to reduce that cost without affecting our students negatively, continuing to provide the resources and supports to get them across the finish line. So our proposal is to hire one secondary certified teacher through the 9 through 12 setting that would work with our 2 EAs that we currently have working with students that are in credit recovery, both at Fairfield Freshman Building and Fairfield High School. This would eliminate all the supplemental expenses that we are currently incurring. That teacher, in partnership with the EAs, will monitor students' progress throughout the day, check in with students, handle day-to-day responsibilities for the online platform, and provide support for whatever the student needs to be successful. To give you an indication of the costs that we're talking about with this program, right now in personnel for these supplemental contracts, the district is spending approximately $240,000. For online seat licenses, which we will not be able to reduce, we're spending an additional $36,000. If we take cost of an entry year teacher at roughly $80,000, we believe that this change in programming can save the district approximately $160,000. So it's a substantial cost savings. Are there any questions? I know I ran through that pretty quickly.
So essentially, instead of having like 20 teachers, all ranging from math to sciences to social studies, we're going to hire one general person full-time instead of supplementing extra hours for teachers we already have.
Yeah, conceptually, the idea of a supplemental contract is that the teacher is doing this outside of their contracted time. So during their planned time, they check in on that student. Why aren't you logging on? Those sorts of things. Or after school, I'm available in my classroom to answer all those sorts of questions. So our idea is to have a teacher. They will not have a caseload of students assigned to them. It will not be a traditional 6-bell where you have 25 kids in each class. That's not what it will look like. This person will have all of these students with the EAs, and they will keep track and go knock on the English teacher's door. I need to speak with Johnny. Johnny, I see you haven't logged on in a couple of days. Is there something I can answer for you? It'll look like that rather than how we've been doing it where it was outside the contracted time for those teachers.
Thank you.
And I think that answered my question. We're talking about a group of roughly how many students, do you think, at any given time?
At any given time in our credit recovery labs, 180 kids. But I believe we have made substantial grounds, through the additional funding that we have received recently. We increased our credit recovery offerings. We actually hired 2 additional EAs at one time to get us kind of caught up. And we've been able to reduce those to more manageable because, again, I think we're where we were pre-COVID, and I think this is kind of where we're going to be with students. It's just, a certain percentage of kids are going to fail biology every year. A certain percentage of kids are going to fail algebra every year. It's just the nature of high school students. So we're always going to have a need for this system. That's where 9 through 12 is just different than any other building. We have a finish line that we have to get to, and we have to get that certain number in certain classes. So we're always going to be chasing it, or through summer school, through credit recovery, all of those sorts of things.
Great. Thank you.
I think it's back to Ms. Lane now.
Thank you. So I am proposing some reductions to our building department budgets, basically a 10% cut to those budgets, and also some elimination of some professional development funds that we provide from the general fund. Now, professional development funds are also part of a federal grant that we receive. Though we're not talking about those funds, those would still be available to our staff for professional development. So overall, between the reductions in the building and department budgets and that small piece of professional development funds, it's about $125,000 in savings. I'll turn it over to Mr. Perry if there's no questions.
Thank you. The capital improvement plan redesign is focused primarily on working with the team to prioritize only essential capital projects. Through this process, we will make sure that the priority of safety and security will not be compromised. Additionally, we are exploring ways to take good care of our facilities without high-dollar replacements. Again, this is engaging with the team to identify areas that we can support, maximizing our internal resources. A few examples I would like to share with you tonight would be the replacement of 2 sets of bleachers at 2 different elementary schools. They are functional, and we continue to maintain those. And as we would like to replace them, those are items that can wait. In addition, the replacement of the visitor bleachers at the stadium. Again, something that we would like to focus on, but at this time, it just does not meet that essential classification. And also, I want to highlight that we are also looking at reducing some of the annual budgets that we use for some of our items, and in particular, our blacktop budget, which is district-wide, which we still need to maintain because those costs do not go down, and they do continue to, not fixing it actually as much as doubles the problem the following year, but trying to find a way to maximize our budget a little bit better and then reducing it by as much as just 10%, so we still will maintain that. Also, I'd like to highlight the fact that we will continue to move forward with some capital projects. The work will not completely stop, as we still need to maintain our facilities, and will continue to maintain our facilities for our student, staff, and our community. Any questions? That was kind of broad, but.
I understand. I think we've been good stewards of our money. We have 11 buildings, the grounds of 11 buildings, on and on. HVAC projects, you mentioned blacktop. It's expensive and it's ongoing. And to your point, safety has obviously got to be a concern, and these things will have to continue.
Absolutely.
If we can tighten our belts some, great.
Yeah. And we addressed this as recently at the last administrator meeting, highlighting that I want to make sure that my department continues to engage with building and administration on needs that they may see. Like, we do not want to close those lines of communications down. So wanted to make sure we stress that at this time, making sure everybody understood.
And I have a question.
Sure.
The capital projects that you will continue to move forward on, have you ranked those or set some type of priority associated with those particular projects?
Absolutely. Even though we're looking at over the next 5 years, in particular, we started even looking at projects that we have not completed this year that were in the budget. So we even started on this year's budget of looking at items that we have not completed. And this is also an opportunity to highlight, we did receive that safety grant money. So we are trying to figure out ways to maximize that. So even though those items may be seen as large expenditures, those are coming from grant funds that we did receive.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Mrs. Lane?
Thank you. So we talked about earlier, I gave you a recap of what the November forecast showed. Since that November forecast, of course, it's a very fluid document, changes almost weekly. So as things have been happening, I've been updating that. Just to point out some of the revenue changes, we received our new property values in late December, beginning of January. So those have been updated into the forecast, along with maybe some tweaking of some tax collections. School funding, as they make changes sometimes to different categories within that Fair School Funding Plan, there's been tweaks done to that. under the expenditure side, we have a figure in there for our bus purchases, and then we just received word that that money's not going to be enough, that they've increased those by $30,000 a bus, which we were not, again, inflation. The stadium turf is another big piece that was planned in our general fund budget for capital improvements. That does need to be replaced, that turf. So what we have done is we have another pot of money called the Permanent Improvement Fund. We have about $960,000 in that fund. So we are now shifting that expenditure to come out of that other bucket, I'll call it, from permanent improvement. Any expenditures out of that fund have to last 5 or more years. So that is not for daily operations, it's for basically capital improvements that last 5 years or longer. So that is going to be a shift that you'll see when I update the forecast in May or at the next meeting to show you that that has now been shifted out of the 5-year forecast.
Ms. Lane, how long's the current field been installed?
It's over 10 years.
It's 12.
Is it 12?
I believe so. It's actually, I just had a conversation with the Moats group who installed it, because we're talking to them about the replacement. And one of the questions I had for them was in regards to padding. And is that something that we need to look at this replacement, or can we move on? And they said that they reassured that it's still under warranty and that we were okay only to replace the turf, which is it's over $300,000 to replace the padding, which is a good thing, but it's definitely at end of life. I asked Moats that question, like, what are you seeing in school districts? They're saying they see anywhere from 8, 12 years is about the max, and that's about where we're at.
And we don't have an exact price. An approximate amount is about $525,000, $535,000 to replace that turf.
I think people would be surprised to think that it's been 10 or 12 years already. Yeah, it's gone quick.
And then just to give you in the audience a review, levy history from 2011 and through 2022. So our last levy that was on the ballot was our bond issue, which built Compass, Freshman, and Central. Those funds are strictly used for construction. We also had to have $500,000 of that $3 million set aside for our maintenance and permanent improvement fund. So those monies get used as we need to update things at Compass, Central, and Freshman, and then a small piece we get to set aside to use for permanent improvements. So that was the last time, seems a lot longer than that we had a levy on the ballot. The last time we had an operating levy, so that's for day-to-day operations, was back in November of 2011. And at that time, we had projected that that levy would only last 2 to 3 years. Luckily, it has lasted more than 11 years, and that's not too many people can say that when they've passed an operating levy. But that was 6.5 mils back then, and we've been fiscally responsible with that money, but it is running out, and so it's time that the board considers placing another operating levy on the ballot at some point. So I will turn it back over to Mr. Smith to finish our presentation.
Thank you, Mrs. Lane. So just in closing, I know that this is a lot to take in 35 minutes, which is why we decided to break this into 2 parts. This is a lot, and we thought it was wise to just let the board process this, think on this for several weeks. As you know, how you are feeling now is how we've been feeling for quite some time. I want to talk a little bit about this process and the difficulty in doing this. This has not been easy at all to identify these cost-saving measures. I think part of the reason that it wasn't easy is because that we have been fiscally responsible and that we haven't, implemented all kinds of new programs and things over the years that we didn't think were essential. And so nothing really jumps off the paper for us, as to, hey, this is an easy one. I want you and our community to know that none of this came easy for our leadership team. As we had conversations about these different items, it was very common for someone to say, well, we can't do that. We got to find somewhere else. But the reality is there's nowhere else to go. I'm not saying that we won't find some more opportunities. As I alluded to earlier, we've already found some. We just have to do some additional research. But it's not easy. And when I talked about minimizing the impact on teaching and learning, I'll give you an example, something to support that. So we are projecting that these cost-cutting measures will save us approximately $4.3 million over the course of the next several years. Now, I do want to point out that that number is fluid. It could change, it could go up, it could go down. But the point I want to make, of the $4.3 million in savings, $3.4 million of that came from changes to our capital improvement plan. So it came from the area of facilities. Some people might say, well, that's an easy target. Well, the reality is it is easier because it doesn't directly impact teaching and learning. However, it does impact it indirectly. And, you can't neglect your facilities long term. I mean, you can't neglect them in the short term. As Mr. Perry said, safety and security will not be compromised. Air conditioning and heat will not be compromised. You're talking about blacktopping. You're talking about purchasing of buses. But eventually, that can't wait. And, we have a lot of facilities here. And things can happen, and I'm sure they will happen over the next several years. Things that could cost millions of dollars that aren't in the forecast but have to be addressed. So again, I think the fact that $3.4 million of the $4.3 comes out of capital improvement gives you an idea of how much the reality that we were trying really hard not to directly impact teaching and learning. But if you want to get some savings, I mean, you have to find some other places to save money. In a perfect world, I wish we wouldn't be having these conversations, but we don't live in a perfect world. And we recognize the challenge of passing an operating levy. And so we thought it was critical that we identify some ways that we could save some money so that we could reduce the size of that levy when we get to that point. So that's just a little bit kind of behind the scenes. It's new for you because you're just hearing it tonight. But we've been having those difficult conversations for quite some time. We will continue to have those conversations about some additional opportunities. And again, our priority will continue to be to minimize that impact on teaching and learning, as that is our most important priority. And in the end, we're trying to make sure that doesn't get impacted in a major way down the line. This is all about the future. So that's been our goal. So at this time, the team would be happy to answer any questions that you have. I know we've answered a few. And not just questions, but also welcome any feedback regarding the information that we've shared this evening.
Mr. Smith, thank you. for the initial presentation. Ms. Lane, great job. Ms. Howard, thank you. Dr. Rice, Mr. Perry. I think it's the transparency that Ms. Lane has always had with us as long as I've been on the board and as a parent with school children in this district, I think has been just that, transparent. I think it goes to show a lot of good stewardship with funds. Our turf's 12 years old. We talked several months ago about the buses. We cut back on how we maintain and buy buses. We've minimized some of that to get maximum use out of those buses. Finding a $40,000 savings may not sound like a lot in the big picture, but it's a lot. It's little pieces that we need to look for. And like you mentioned, we may uncover others that will help subsidize the need for a larger levy. The capital improvements, $3 million in cutbacks out of that 4.3, we do need to take care of our buildings. Safety is first, and I'm glad to hear you say that, and I think we all agree with that. But it's just some things that we have to think about and put eyes on. Do we really need to do it now or not? And you said something a minute ago. We've talked about this over the year, so it's not totally blank to the community that we do see what goes on. We do see the financial reports. We do review those as a board. But to have this a couple times a year and a little earlier this year is grateful because it does need to be brought out there. And that's, again, one thing I love about our district that is transparent. We are very clear and good stewards. I hear and see what goes on with some other districts, and I think we do a fantastic job. Ms. Lane, kudos to you for your due diligence with that and all your erasing, moving, and trying to balance the books the best it can be. I mean, it's inevitable, but I think we've done a great job over the last decade. It's been, 12 years since the last levy, 13 years, something like that? That says a lot when it was supposed to last 2 to 3 years. So we'll get through it. But like bringing this to the community, those in the audience, those listening, it's something that's real. And we have to address it, and we will. We'll do it together as a community.
Thank you. Thoughts?
I agree. You guys have always been very transparent, especially since I've been on the board. I knew coming in that this was going to be something coming up on the coming years. I appreciate you guys putting the work in before even presenting to us, looking at what we can start kind of dwindling down now so we can know what we need in the future for the absolute needs. And I'm very happy to hear that we're going to keep the integrity of our education to our students because that's obviously our number one goal. And I am super impressed, as always, Nancy, that you made the last levy last for 11 years, and I hope that we can.
It wasn't just me.
I understand. Sorry.
It was a team effort from everybody.
I want to clarify. I apologize for you leading the team that helped bring that funds and helping them move around and educating me on how that happened and how the whole team did it.
Thank you.
You take the darts, take the credit.
Okay.
That's a true
In all
statement.
fairness,
True statement.
when we are sitting around the table having conversations, Nancy does keep us focused on all the costs, the potential hidden costs. It's very common for her to say, yeah, but can we do this in a different way so that we could save some money? That is very common, Nancy. So under your leadership, thank you.
Sometimes it's a curse.
You deserve a lot of credit.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Done.
I would agree with everything that's been said, and I do appreciate the fact that you guys have been great fiscal stewards of the public's dollars. And, Nancy, over the years, when I've wanted to spend a little here, you are quick to pull me back in.
Sorry.
No, I'm grateful for that, and it's at times like these that I'm even more appreciative of what you do and what your responsibilities are. And so Billy, Nancy, the whole entire team, thank you for putting this together and thinking about the students and our educational programs first and foremost. That means a lot. I mean, a lot. Having been on the board where we've gone through this before, this feels different, and so I really appreciate it. Thank you. We'll get through it. We'll do what we need to do, and levies, we'll get that done. Thank you.
So you mentioned, I think you alluded to it, it's new tonight because we're hearing this presentation for the first time, but this isn't a new concept to us. It shouldn't be a new concept to the public either, and that five-year forecast, we've consistently talked about that cash balance, that green line going down, right? And, there's no sugarcoating it, right? Teaching is a labor-intensive practice. It just is. And so a large part of the budget is teacher salaries and teacher benefits. Part of those benefits are their insurance. And you saw tonight, 17.9% increase. No guarantee that it won't be the same again next year or the year after that, right? So these are fixed costs, in essence, that have to be addressed one way or another. You alluded to it, and I think it was important. The ESSER funds that we've been provided, I think we used very appropriately, and it showed up on our state report card. And that's a point that we need to make and emphasize moving forward. Everyone said, we'll get through it together. There's no good time to put a levy on the ballot. We understand that. But when it's time, it's time. And these are essential cuts that we need to make to, I think, to prepare the public and to put us in the best place possible to pass an appropriate levy, one that I think hopefully will be well received.
Thank you.
Okay, great. Thanks for that presentation.